Welcome. Settle into your bed, dim the lights, and let your body grow heavy and still. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to remember, nothing to do at all. Just a story, softly told, to carry you into sleep. Tonight, we travel back, more than 3,000 years, to a magnificent harbor town on a small island in a warm and ancient sea, a town so advanced for its age that some believe its memory became a legend. This is the Hush Historian. Close your eyes, if you would like. I will take it from here. Below the calm green slopes of the island's mountain, the harbor town of Akrotiri rose in terraces of stone and painted plaster, its multi-story buildings catching the first color of a dawn that had broken over this same water for as long as anyone could remember. It was, by any measure, a wealthy and beautiful place, and it had never once given Talos any reason to believe he belonged to its wealth. Down in the harbor, dark wooden ships rode at anchor, their hulls reflected in water still black with the last of the night, waiting for the light that would send them out again toward distant shores and the trade that had made this town rich. Talos had never sailed on any of them. His trade was conducted entirely on land, and largely in shadow. He woke in the narrow upper room he rented from a woman who asked no questions, and moved down the worn stone stairwell with the particular quiet of a man who had learned, long ago, that unnecessary noise was the enemy of a useful life. Below him, in the room he passed, other tenants still slept, unaware of the hour or the man moving past their door. On the windowsill, where he always left them before sleep, sat the modest proceeds of the day before, a handful of coins, a small bronze trinket not yet sold, a knife worn smooth from years of careful use. He gathered what he needed and left the rest, the way a craftsman leaves his tools for the next day's work. He stepped out into streets still mostly empty, moving between buildings whose painted doorframes and elegant stonework spoke of a prosperity Talos observed closely but had never shared in, not by birth, and not, so far, by any of the careful theft that had become his particular skill. On the corner of a wealthy courtyard, a fresco caught the very first warm light, painted monkeys and swallows and antelope rendered in ochre and blue by hands far more respected than his own. Talos paused before it briefly, the way he sometimes did, appreciating a beauty that asked nothing of him and threatened nothing in return. By the time he reached the lower streets, the harbor market had begun stirring into its daily business, merchants arranging goods brought from ports across the wide trading world, fishermen hauling in the night's catch, the whole complicated machinery of a wealthy town's morning commerce beginning to turn. He moved through the thickening crowd the way water moves through stone, unnoticed, unhurried, his hands finding what they needed to find with a skill so practiced it required almost no conscious thought at all. It was not an honest trade. Talos had made his peace with that fact many years before. A merchant's stall nearby held painted pottery from Crete, ingots of copper from distant mines, textiles dyed in colors Talos could not have named, the accumulated wealth of a trading network that reached further than he had ever personally traveled, and further, certainly, than his own modest thefts would ever meaningfully diminish. The buildings along this street rose taller than most in the town, wooden balconies overhanging the narrow way, painted facades announcing the wealth of the families within, and Talos walked beneath them with the particular attention of a man who read architecture the way a scholar reads a scroll, always alert to what a building's face might say about what it hid inside. Deucalion sat where he always sat at this hour, in the shadowed doorway of a modest building near the market's edge, watching the street with the patient stillness of a man who had spent 40 years learning that the world revealed its opportunities only to those willing to simply wait and observe them. He had trained Talos in this craft from the boy's earliest years, teaching him not only the practical skills of the trade but its deeper philosophy, that a good thief took only what would not be sorely missed, and never took anything at all from those who could not afford the loss. Talos crouched beside him now, and the old man sketched a rough plan into the dust with a stick. The plan concerned a particular building, a grand villa near the town's upper terraces, its owner a wealthy trader recently returned from a long voyage with, by every reliable rumor, cargo valuable enough to fund both their lives comfortably for years to come. Deucalion had been watching that house for weeks. Talos studied the villa now with his own eyes, its ornate entrance and multiple stories setting it apart even among the town's generally impressive architecture, a building that spoke, in every carved detail, of wealth accumulated across generations rather than earned in any single lifetime. Ariadne joined him there, as she often did, standing across the narrow street with the easy unremarkable posture of someone simply passing through, though her eyes moved across the villa's face with the same careful attention Talos gave it. She had grown up on these docks, and she read a building's weaknesses better than anyone he knew. Above them, an ornate window and carved wooden balcony marked the villa's upper story, the intricate stonework a display of wealth that Talos found, in his private judgment, slightly excessive for a single family's use, a judgment that made the theft he and Deucalion were planning feel, if not entirely justified, at least understandable. By midday, Talos had climbed to a high terrace overlooking the whole town, taking in the view he sometimes sought out when the crowded streets grew too close, the elegant rooftops descending in terraces toward the busy harbor, the calm green mountain rising behind it all, a view that never failed to remind him how much beauty this town contained, regardless of who owned which particular piece of it. Below him, in a modest workshop, a potter's finished vessel sat cooling on a stone shelf, its spiral and marine patterns rendered with a skill Talos admired without at all wishing to imitate. Every trade in this town, he had come to believe, required its own kind of patience, and he respected the potter's patience as much as he trusted his own. He found Deucalion again in a shaded alcove near the market, and the two of them spoke quietly of the coming plan, the details of timing and entry that would determine whether the villa's cargo became, before the season turned, a considerably safer arrangement for two men who had never had much safety of their own. Near the public square, a small crowd had gathered at the shrine that marked the town center, ordinary people performing the ordinary small rituals of an ordinary day, and Talos passed among them without pausing, his attention already returning to the narrow calculations of his planned work. He ducked into a side alley to avoid the notice of a passing patrol, glancing back once over his shoulder with the practiced casualness of a man who had spent years making unwanted attention simply slide past him. It was not always successful. Nestor stood at the corner beyond, staff in hand, his eyes moving across the crowd with the particular thoroughness of a watchman who had learned, across many years, exactly which faces belonged to which kinds of trouble. He had chased Talos through these streets more times than either man cared to count, and neither had yet fully won. Across the busy square, the two men held their distance from one another, a quiet and almost familiar tension passing between them, two people who understood their opposition well enough, by now, to almost respect it. Nestor's baldric and staff marked him clearly as an officer of the town's order, an order Talos had spent his whole adult life quietly working around rather than against. Down at the harbor, the day's real business continued regardless of any small dramas playing out in the streets above, ships loading amphorae of oil and wine bound for distant markets, dockworkers moving with the steady rhythm of people whose livelihoods depended on the sea's continued generosity. Ariadne worked among them for a portion of every day, coiling ropes and loading cargo with the same competence she brought to everything, glancing up now and then toward the town above, where she knew Talos and Deucalion were finalizing plans she had already agreed to help carry out. From the high terrace, the whole scene came together into a single breathtaking view, the wealthy rooftops, the busy harbor, the ships, the mountains standing calm and green above it all, a civilization at what anyone standing there that afternoon would have called the very height of its long and prosperous life. In a modest workshop nearby, a finished ceramic vessel waited to be sold, its dolphins and waves painted with the same confident skill that marked everything this town produced, evidence, in its own small way, of a people who had learned to make even their everyday objects beautiful. Talos and Deucalion spoke once more in their quiet alcove as the afternoon lengthened, settling the final details of a plan that would, within days, either free them both from years of careful scraping, or cost them more than either was willing to name aloud. The mountain stood behind the town as it always stood, calm and green in the gathering gold of late afternoon, giving no sign at all, to any eye that looked upon it that day, of anything other than the same patient, unremarkable presence it had always offered this beautiful and prosperous harbor town. It happened in the late afternoon, not long after Talos and Deucalion had finished settling the details of their plan, a single hard shudder that passed through the ground beneath the town and was gone again almost before anyone could name what had happened. Pottery rattled on shelves. A stack of amphorae near the harbor toppled with a crash that drew startled attention from every dock worker within earshot. And then, as quickly as it had come, the trembling passed, and the town settled back into its ordinary rhythm as though nothing at all had occurred. Talos felt it while crouched in the alcove with Deucalion, and watched the old man's face carefully in the moment after, searching for whatever reaction 40 years of experience might produce. Deucalion said nothing at first, only waited, the way he waited for everything, to see whether the tremor would repeat itself or prove to be nothing more than the ground's occasional habit of settling. It did not repeat, not immediately, and the town's initial startled murmur soon dissolved back into its usual business, merchants resuming their transactions, dock workers returning to their loading, the small crowd near the shrine finishing whatever rituals the tremor had briefly interrupted. Tremors were not unknown on this island. The ground here had always had its moods, and the people had long since learned not to give every shiver more attention than it deserved. Ariadne found Talos not long after, having felt the tremor from the harbor where the ships had rocked visibly at their moorings, and she asked him, with the particular bluntness she reserved for matters she considered genuinely serious, whether this changed anything about their plan. Talos considered the question honestly before answering. He did not think it did. The ground shook sometimes. It always had. He saw no reason this particular shaking should be different from any before it. Deucalion, listening to this exchange, offered his own measured opinion, drawn from decades of watching the island's occasional moods. He had felt tremors before, he said, some stronger than this one, and the town had always simply continued afterward, its ordinary business resuming as though the ground had never spoken at all. He saw no immediate cause for alarm, only a reason, perhaps, to keep a slightly more attentive ear turned toward the earth in the days ahead. Talos returned to his rented room that evening with the tremor already fading from his immediate attention, his mind occupied instead with the finer details of the coming theft, the particular hour when the villa's household would be most soundly asleep, the exact path across the rooftops that would let him avoid the streets where Nestor's patrols moved most frequently. It was, in every way that mattered to him, an ordinary evening's planning, no different from 100 such evenings before it. He ate a simple meal alone, bread and olives and a little wine bought cheaply from a tavern near the market, and turned the plan over once more in his mind, checking it against every contingency he could imagine, the particular discipline that had kept him alive and unimprisoned across years of a trade that punished carelessness severely. A good thief, Deucalion had always told him, worries about everything in advance so that he need worry about nothing in the moment. Outside, the town settled into its evening quiet, lamps being lit in windows across the terraced buildings, the last of the harbor's daytime commerce winding down as ships secured for the night and merchants closed their stalls. Talos listened to these familiar sounds through his small window, the particular music of a prosperous town settling toward rest, and felt none of the unease that, in later days, he would wish he had felt sooner. He thought briefly of Nestor, of the watchman's patrols that would need careful avoiding on the night of the theft itself, and allowed himself a small private satisfaction at how thoroughly he had already mapped the man's routes and habits. Nestor was skilled, and dogged, and had come closer to catching Talos than any other officer in the town's employ, but Talos had spent years learning to stay one careful step ahead of him, and saw no reason that pattern should break now. Ariadne visited him briefly before the evening fully settled, bringing news that the tremor had caused only minor damage near the harbor, a few broken vessels, nothing more serious, and that the town's general mood had already returned to its ordinary unconcern. She sat with him a while, going over her own portion of the plan, the particular signal she would give from the harbor once the ship they intended to use for their escape stood ready. They spoke, as they often did in these quiet evening hours, of what would come after the theft succeeded, the modest but genuine freedoms it would purchase, a life no longer dependent on the constant careful calculation that had shaped every day of both their lives so far. It was a comforting conversation, familiar in its shape, the kind of talk that had sustained them both through many harder years. Deucalion, when Talos visited him briefly before retiring, seemed in good spirits despite his age and the day's small tremor, speaking with his usual dry humor of the villa's owner, a man whose wealth, in the old thief's judgment, had always exceeded his deserving of it. Talos left him in good humor as well, the plan settled, the details checked, the ordinary business of an ordinary evening winding down toward sleep. He lay awake a while longer than usual that night, listening to the quiet town beyond his window, and told himself, as he drifted finally toward sleep, that tomorrow would bring nothing more than the continuation of a plan he had already turned over 100 times, in a town that had, whatever small tremors it occasionally offered, always proven steady and reliable beneath his feet. The days that followed brought no further tremors of any real note, only the ordinary business of a prosperous town continuing its ordinary rhythms, and Talos found his earlier attention to the ground's brief shudder fading, as such things generally faded, back into the general unremarkable texture of daily life. There was, after all, a theft to finalize, and a theft required a man's full and undivided attention. He spent these days refining the plan's final details with Deucalion, walking the route across the rooftops twice more at night to confirm every foothold and gap, checking the villa's household routines one final time to be certain nothing had changed since their weeks of careful observation. Ariadne, for her part, secured passage on a ship bound for a distant port, timed to depart just after the theft's completion, carrying them beyond any immediate pursuit Nestor might mount. It was on the third day after the first tremor that Talos noticed the well near the market tasted subtly different when he stopped to drink from it, a faint mineral edge he could not quite place, similar to what he had once heard old sailors describe of waters near certain volcanic springs. He mentioned it to no one, assuming it was simply one of the small unremarkable variations any well occasionally offered. That same afternoon, a second tremor passed through the town, gentler than the first but longer, a slow rolling shudder that rattled shutters and sent a scattering of birds up from the rooftops in a single startled wave. Talos felt it while standing in the market, and watched the faces around him for reaction, finding mostly the same mild unconcern the first tremor had produced, a few murmured comments, a brief pause in conversation, and then the ordinary business of buying and selling resuming as before. Nestor, Talos noticed, seemed more attentive than usual in the days following this second tremor, walking his patrols with a watchfulness that extended, for once, beyond simply searching for known troublemakers, his eyes moving more often toward the mountain that rose calm and green above the town. Talos wondered, briefly, what the watchman might be noticing that he himself had not, but did not allow the wondering to distract him for long from the more immediate concerns of his own planning. Deucalion, when Talos raised the matter of the strange well water and the second tremor, listened with more genuine attention than he had offered the first shudder, his old eyes narrowing slightly in a way Talos had learned, across years of apprenticeship, to take seriously. The old thief did not say the signs alarmed him. He said only that he intended to watch the mountain a little more closely himself in the coming days, and suggested Talos might do the same. This small caution did not, in itself, change either man's commitment to the plan already so carefully laid, and Talos found himself, in the days that followed, holding two thoughts at once without much difficulty, the steady practical focus the theft required, and a faint new awareness of the mountain's presence that had not troubled him before. It was possible, he told himself, to watch for danger while still moving forward with ordinary business. People did it every day, in every trade that carried any risk at all. Ariadne reported that the ship's captain, a man who had sailed these waters for 30 years, had mentioned the recent tremors himself, in the offhand way sailors mention most natural signs, neither alarmed nor entirely dismissive, simply noting that the island had felt restless lately in a manner he could not quite recall from previous seasons. He had not, however, altered his own sailing plans on account of it, and Ariadne saw no reason their own plans should be altered either. Talos walked the town's upper terrace again on the fourth day, seeking the view he sometimes sought when his thoughts grew too crowded with planning, and found himself studying the mountain longer than he usually did, searching its calm green slopes for whatever sign might explain the strange water and the gentle repeated shuddering of the ground beneath the town. He found nothing he could clearly name as dangerous, only the same patient, unremarkable mountain that had always stood there. A third tremor came that evening, briefer than the second but sharper, enough to crack a section of plaster on a building near the market and send a genuine current of concern through the crowd gathered there at the time. Talos felt this one more distinctly than the others, a hard jolt rather than a rolling shudder, and noticed, for the first time, real unease on faces around him rather than mere mild interest. Nestor was among those gathered near the cracked plaster afterward, speaking in low tones with several other officers, and Talos, passing close enough to catch fragments of the conversation, heard the watchman mention, with unusual seriousness, that he intended to raise the matter with the town's elders, that 3 tremors in as many days seemed, to his experienced judgment, worth more official attention than the town had yet given it. Talos returned to Deucalion that night with this news, and found the old thief more thoughtful than he had been in all their years together, turning the matter over with the same careful patience he usually reserved for planning a theft rather than assessing a danger. Perhaps, Deucalion said finally, they should complete their work sooner rather than later, before whatever the mountain was considering had time to fully make up its mind. The town's elders convened the following morning, an unusual gathering called specifically to discuss the recent tremors, and word of the meeting spread quickly through the market and the harbor, carrying with it a current of concern that had not existed in the town just days before. Talos attended at the edge of the gathered crowd, as did most of the town's residents, drawn by the same uneasy curiosity that had brought everyone else. The elders spoke first of precedent, recalling tremors from years past that had passed without serious consequence, the ground's occasional restlessness having always, in living memory, resolved itself without lasting harm to the town or its people. This recollection offered some comfort to the gathered crowd, murmurs of reassurance passing among the older residents who remembered those previous seasons clearly. But one elder, a woman known for her careful attention to the mountain's moods across many decades of observation, spoke with more caution than the others, noting that the well water's strange taste and the increasing frequency of the tremors together suggested something she could not fully explain from precedent alone. She recommended, cautiously, that households begin keeping essential belongings ready should a swift departure become necessary. This recommendation drew mixed reaction from the crowd, some nodding in serious agreement, others exchanging skeptical glances at what seemed, to them, an overly cautious response to what remained, after all, only a somewhat unusual pattern of ordinary tremors. Talos found himself uncertain which reaction to trust, his own limited experience of the mountain's moods offering him no clear basis for judgment either way. Nestor spoke as well, offering his own account of the tremors pattern and the cracked plaster near the market, and recommended, with the particular firmness of a man used to being taken seriously in matters of town safety, that the harbor's ships be kept ready for swift departure regardless of what the elders ultimately decided about household preparations. Several ship captains, Talos noted, seemed already inclined to agree with him. The gathering dispersed without any single unified decision, households left largely to their own judgment about how seriously to take the recent signs, and Talos made his way back through the market crowd turning the whole matter over in his mind, uncertain whether he had just witnessed reasonable caution or excessive alarm, and increasingly aware that he needed to decide, soon, how the uncertainty should shape his own plans. He found Deucalion afterward in their usual alcove, and relayed what the elders had said, watching the old thief's face for some indication of how seriously to weigh it. Deucalion listened without interrupting, and when Talos finished, sat quietly for a long moment before offering his judgment. He had lived on this island his entire long life, he said, and had never known the elders to gather so formally over mere ordinary tremors. Whatever this was, it was not entirely ordinary, whatever the reassuring precedent some among them wished to recall. This judgment settled something in Talos that the elders' divided meeting had not managed to settle, a clearer sense that caution, at least, cost little, whatever the mountain ultimately decided to do. He suggested to Deucalion that they might move the theft forward, completing it within days rather than the week or more they had originally planned, so as to be genuinely ready to leave should the signs continue to worsen. Deucalion agreed to this readily, his own instincts apparently moving in the same direction, and the two of them spent the remainder of that day quietly accelerating their preparations, checking details a second time that they had already checked once, ensuring nothing in their plan depended on timing they could no longer fully control. Ariadne, when Talos found her at the harbor, reported that several ship captains had indeed begun keeping their vessels more consistently ready than usual, provisioned and available for quick departure, a quiet practical response to uncertainty that required no formal decision from the elders to implement. She agreed without hesitation that their own timeline should move forward as well. That evening, walking home through streets that seemed, to Talos' now more attentive eye, to carry a slightly different mood than they had carried just days before, a certain watchfulness in the faces he passed, a certain quickness in how households secured their doors, he found himself grateful, for the first time in his adult life, for a trade that had taught him to plan carefully for uncertain futures. Whatever the mountain intended, he told himself, he would not be caught unprepared by it. He passed the well near the market on his way and stopped, out of habit, to drink, and found the water's strange mineral edge sharper than it had been even a few days before, unmistakable now rather than merely faint, a small and undeniable confirmation that whatever process had begun beneath this island's calm green slopes, it was not slowing down. With their timeline now compressed, Talos and Deucalion moved through the following days with a focused urgency neither man had needed to summon in years, checking and rechecking every detail of the plan against the possibility that they might have only days, rather than the comfortable week they had originally allowed themselves, before circumstances forced their hand regardless of their own readiness. Talos walked the rooftop route once more in the deepest hours of night, confirming each foothold by feel in the darkness the theft itself would require, and found the familiar path unchanged despite the ground's recent restlessness, a small comfort in the midst of a mounting uncertainty that seemed to color every other aspect of the town's daily life now. Nestor's patrols had grown noticeably more frequent and more thorough in these same days, the watchman clearly dividing his attention now between his usual pursuit of the town's petty criminals and a genuine concern for broader public order should the tremors continue or worsen. Talos found this an unwelcome complication, requiring more careful timing than he had originally planned, though not, he judged, an insurmountable one. Ariadne secured final confirmation from the ship's captain that their vessel would be ready to depart on the agreed evening regardless of weather or further tremors, the captain himself now eager to leave port sooner rather than later given the island's uncertain mood, a coincidence of timing that suited their own purposes perfectly, whatever unease lay behind the captain's own eagerness. A fourth tremor struck on the second day of this accelerated preparation, stronger than any before it, enough to send several people running from buildings in genuine alarm and to crack the plaster of more than one structure near the market square. Talos felt the ground move beneath his feet with a violence that finally, fully, displaced whatever remaining calm he had managed to maintain about the whole uncertain situation. The town's mood shifted visibly after this fourth tremor, the earlier divided opinion between caution and reassurance collapsing now toward something closer to universal concern, households beginning in earnest to gather belongings, several families making for the harbor directly to secure passage on whatever ships remained willing to take them. Deucalion, when Talos found him amid this gathering unease, showed for the first time a genuine gravity that unsettled Talos more than the tremor itself had. The old thief said plainly that he believed they should complete the theft the following night, regardless of any remaining details left unconfirmed, rather than risk the mountain's patience running out before their own plans reached completion. Talos agreed without argument, understanding now, in a way the earlier tremors had not quite forced him to understand, that whatever they intended to do in this town, they needed to do it soon, and that every day of delay now carried a cost that had not existed just a week before. He spent that remaining day in final preparation, checking equipment, confirming routes, allowing himself no further margin for the careful excessive caution that had once been his trademark. Ariadne moved through the increasingly anxious harbor with her own quiet efficiency, securing their places aboard the departing ship with a firmness that brooked no complication, and reported to Talos that evening that the vessel would sail the following night regardless of circumstances, giving them a single clear window in which both the theft and their departure needed to be accomplished together. Nestor's patrols, meanwhile, had grown thin and distracted, the watchman's attention pulled increasingly toward the genuine public disorder the tremors were beginning to cause rather than toward his usual careful pursuit of known thieves, a shift that Talos recognized, with a discomfort he had not expected to feel, as circumstance finally working in his favor for reasons that gave him no real satisfaction. That night, lying in his rented room for what he suspected might be one of his last nights within its familiar walls, Talos found himself thinking less of the theft's careful details and more of the town itself, the market he had known his whole life, the harbor, the painted buildings, the mountain that had always simply stood there being calm and green and unremarkable until, apparently, it had decided to stop. He did not know, lying there in the dark, whether the mountain's restlessness would resolve as the previous season's tremors always had, or whether it represented something genuinely new and dangerous. He knew only that tomorrow night, one way or another, his life in this town would change completely, either through the success of a plan years in the making, or through whatever the mountain itself finally chose to do. The following evening arrived with a strange stillness in the air, the mountain quiet for the first time in days, no tremor disturbing the ground since the previous morning, and Talos found this quiet more unsettling, in its way, than the shaking had been, a held breath rather than a genuine calm. He met Deucalion at their usual alcove as the light failed, and the two of them reviewed the plan one final time in low, careful voices. Ariadne joined them briefly before making her way to the harbor, where she would wait aboard the readied ship for their arrival, her role in the theft itself complete once she had confirmed, earlier that day, that the villa's household had followed its usual evening routine without any disruption from the town's broader unease. The wealthy rarely changed their habits, Deucalion had always said, no matter what the world around them was doing. Talos moved through the darkening streets toward the villa with the particular focused calm his years of training had built in him, his earlier fear folded now into the careful attention the work itself required, no room left for anything but the immediate task of climbing, entering, and taking what he had come to take. The rooftop route unfolded beneath his hands exactly as he had confirmed it would, each foothold precisely where his careful preparation had promised it. He reached the villa's upper story without incident, the household below settled into its evening quiet exactly as Ariadne's observation had predicted, and found the entry point Deucalion had identified weeks before still unguarded and accessible. The cargo they had come for lay where their careful observation had placed it, valuable enough, even in the dim light, to justify every hour of planning that had led to this moment. He worked quickly and quietly, gathering what he and Deucalion had agreed to take, careful to leave the household's other possessions undisturbed, a discipline Deucalion had always insisted upon, that a good thief took only what he had come for and nothing more, both as a matter of practical safety and, in the old man's own private philosophy, a matter of some remaining honor even within a dishonest trade. He was nearly finished, the gathered goods secured for the climb back down, when the ground beneath the villa gave a single hard, sudden lurch, far stronger than any tremor of the preceding days, strong enough to throw him against the wall and send a section of the villa's own plaster ceiling crashing down into the room below. Talos steadied himself against the shaking wall, his careful discipline momentarily overwhelmed by a fear more immediate than any he had felt in the theft's planning, and heard, from below, the sudden alarmed cries of the household waking to a disturbance that had nothing at all to do with his own quiet presence among their possessions. The tremor passed after several long seconds, the longest and most violent yet, leaving the villa's upper floor cracked and unsteady beneath his feet. He knew, in that moment, that his careful plan had encountered something no amount of preparation could have fully accounted for, and understood, with a clarity that cut through even his fear, that his priorities had just shifted completely. The gathered goods remained where he had secured them. But somewhere below, in the household now waking to genuine alarm, were people whose danger suddenly mattered to him more than anything he had come to steal. He moved toward the stairwell rather than his planned exit route, some instinct he had not examined too closely pulling him toward the sounds of distress below rather than away from them, and found, on the villa's second floor, a young household servant trapped beneath a fallen support beam, unable to free herself, her cries the loudest of the general alarm now filling the building. Talos worked the beam free with the same careful hands that had, only minutes before, been gathering another family's wealth for his own purposes, and helped the frightened servant to her feet, guiding her toward the stairs and the courtyard beyond, where the rest of the household had already begun gathering in shaken confusion. He did not know, doing this, whether it represented some genuine change in himself or simply the immediate instinct of any person confronted with another's clear and present danger. He made his way from the villa in the chaos that followed, the gathered goods still secured about him, but found that his mind, for the remainder of that night, kept returning less to the theft's success and more to the servant girl's frightened face, and to the strange fact that he had chosen, in the moment that mattered most, to help rather than simply to flee with what he had come for. The tremor's aftermath filled the streets with a fear Talos had never before witnessed in this town, households emerging in confusion, some already moving toward the harbor with whatever belongings they could carry, the whole careful order of the prosperous town he had grown up in suddenly and visibly fracturing beneath the ground's violent insistence that something, at last, had genuinely and irreversibly begun. Talos found Deucalion waiting at their agreed meeting point near the market, the old thief's face drawn with a concern Talos had rarely seen in him across all their years together, and the two of them assessed, in hurried words, the full scope of what the violent tremor had done to the town around them. Cracks ran through walls that had stood solid for generations. Several buildings near the market had partially collapsed. The strange stillness of the previous hours had broken, decisively, into something the whole town now recognized as genuine danger. Deucalion asked, without any judgment in his voice, why Talos had returned later than planned, and Talos found himself explaining, somewhat to his own surprise, the trapped servant girl and the choice he had made to help her rather than simply completing his escape as planned. The old thief listened to this account with an expression Talos could not quite read, something between surprise and a kind of complicated pride he had not expected to see. There was no time, in the urgency of the moment, to examine the choice more deeply, and the two of them moved quickly now toward the harbor, joining a growing tide of townspeople making the same journey, households carrying what possessions they could manage, children held close, the whole visible population of the wealthy town reduced, in the span of a single violent evening, to a single shared and urgent purpose. The streets that had always felt, to Talos, comfortably familiar now seemed strange and precarious, cracked pavements underfoot, the occasional collapsed wall forcing detours through streets he knew only distantly, the whole physical order of the town he had spent his life navigating suddenly rearranged by forces far larger than any watchman's patrol or household's careless habit. Ariadne met them partway to the harbor, having left the ship briefly to search for them once the tremor's violence became clear from the water, and the relief on her face at finding them both safe was matched only by the urgency in her voice as she explained that the captain intended to depart far sooner than originally planned, unwilling to risk his ship or his crew any longer than absolutely necessary. They pressed on together toward the harbor, the crowd around them thickening with every street, and Talos found himself, amid the fear and the urgency, still turning over the strange choice he had made in the villa, the servant girl's face, the goods he had ultimately still carried away despite the delay, uncertain what exactly the night had revealed about the kind of man he actually was. Near the harbor's edge, they encountered Nestor, the watchman working amid the general chaos to direct frightened townspeople toward the ships with the same steady authority he had always brought to his patrols, though now turned entirely toward saving lives rather than pursuing petty criminals. He recognized Talos immediately, even amid the crowd and the darkness, and for a long moment the two men simply looked at one another, years of careful pursuit suddenly rendered meaningless by the scale of what was actually happening around them. Nestor said nothing about the theft, whatever suspicion he carried about what Talos might have been doing that night set aside entirely in the face of a danger that made such matters, for the first time in either man's memory, genuinely unimportant. He directed them instead toward an open space on the docks where a ship still had room, his voice carrying the same firm competence it always had, now turned entirely toward the town's collective survival. Talos thanked him, an exchange that would have seemed impossible just hours before, and Nestor nodded once, already turning back toward the crowd to direct the next frightened family toward safety. Talos watched him go for a moment, struck by the strange reversal the night had produced, enemy and pursuer both suddenly simply people trying to survive the same overwhelming circumstance together. They reached Ariadne's ship as the captain called for final boarding, the vessel already crowded with townspeople who had secured passage through whatever means available to them, and Talos helped Deucalion aboard with the careful attention he might have once reserved only for the goods he carried, a small shift in priority he did not examine too closely in the urgency of the moment. The ship pushed away from the dock as the last stragglers were pulled aboard, joining a scattered fleet of other vessels now making for open water, the harbor behind them filling with the sound of a whole town's desperate final departure. Talos stood at the rail and watched the receding shore, the terraced buildings, the painted facades, all of it rendered suddenly small and fragile against the darkness of the mountain rising behind them. He did not yet know what the night would ultimately do to the town he was leaving behind. He knew only that he was leaving it, alive, with Deucalion and Ariadne both safely beside him, and with a strange new uncertainty about himself that the violence of the evening had not yet given him time to fully understand. The ship moved out into open water through the remainder of that night, joining the scattered lights of other departing vessels across a dark sea that had, until that evening, never carried so many boats at once for any single ordinary purpose. Talos remained at the rail long after the harbor had fallen out of sight, watching the dark shape of the island recede behind them, unable to look away from the outline of the mountain that dominated its center. Deucalion joined him there after a time, the old thief moving more slowly than usual, the night's exertions clearly having cost him more than either of them wished to acknowledge aloud. He stood beside Talos in silence for a long while, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Talos had not often heard in it. "Whatever happens to that island now," he said, "we are fortunate to be watching it from here rather than from there." Ariadne found them both at the rail as the first gray light of dawn began touching the eastern sky, and reported that the captain intended to hold their current course for some hours yet before turning toward their intended port, unwilling to risk any closer approach to the island while its mood remained so uncertain. She had spoken with several of the other passengers crowded aboard, learning that similar tremors had struck other parts of the island as well, the whole small world of their homeland shaking together in the same violent unease. Talos found himself thinking, in the strange stillness of that dawn crossing, less of the goods still secured in his pack and more of the servant girl he had freed from beneath the fallen beam, of Nestor directing the frightened crowd toward safety, of the whole complicated tangle of a night that had asked more of him than any single theft ever had before. He did not yet have words for what he had learned about himself in those hours, only a persistent sense that something in him had shifted. The sun rose fully as they continued their slow crossing, and with the growing light came the first clear view, from this distance, of smoke rising from the island center, thin at first and then thickening steadily as the morning wore on, a dark column climbing into the clear sky above the place they had all called home for their entire lives. The passengers crowded at the ship's rail grew quiet as they watched this rising column, the earlier relief of successful escape giving way now to a heavier and more complicated grief, the recognition, settling slowly across the whole gathered crowd, that whatever waited behind them on that island, their old lives there had likely ended in the single violent night just past. Talos watched the smoke thicken across the following hours with a strange detachment that he recognized, distantly, as the particular numbness that follows genuine shock, his mind unable to fully process the scale of what the growing column suggested was happening to the town he had known his entire life. Deucalion stood beside him through most of this watching, saying little, his weathered face unreadable in the bright morning light. By midday, the column had grown into something too large to easily comprehend, spreading at its top into a shape unlike any cloud Talos had ever seen, dark and immense, dominating the horizon behind them even at their considerable distance. The captain, watching this same sight from his position at the helm, ordered the ship's course adjusted further away still, unwilling to risk whatever the mountain might yet produce. Ariadne stood close beside Talos through these hours, her own composure visibly strained by what they were all witnessing, and asked him, quietly, whether he thought anyone remained on the island who had not managed to reach the ships in time. Talos did not have an honest answer that offered any comfort, only the observation that the tremors had given clear enough warning, across many days, that most who wished to leave had likely found some way to do so. He thought again, unable to help himself, of the villa's household, of whether the servant girl and her family had managed their own escape in the chaos following the violent tremor, whether his choice to help her rather than simply flee with his stolen goods had, in the end, meant the difference between her survival and some worse fate he could not bring himself to fully imagine. Deucalion, watching him wrestle visibly with these thoughts, offered what comfort he could, observing that a man could only answer for the choices actually before him in the moment they arrived, and that Talos had chosen, when it mattered, to help rather than to simply take, a choice the old thief clearly considered worth more than any cargo either of them carried away that night. The dark column continued rising through the remainder of that day, visible for hours even as their ship carried them steadily further from the island that had produced it, and Talos watched it until distance and the ship's continued course finally rendered it too small and too distant to make out clearly any longer, the last visible sign, from the sea, of a town and a whole way of life that he understood now, with a grief he had not expected to feel so strongly, he would very likely never see again in its familiar living form. The days of their voyage settled into a strange, subdued rhythm after the island fell finally out of sight, the crowded ship carrying its shaken passengers steadily toward a port none of them had ever intended to reach under such circumstances, each person aboard occupied with private versions of the same grief and uncertainty. Talos found himself, in these quieter hours, turning the stolen goods over in his mind more than he examined them with his hands, uncertain now what to feel about wealth acquired on the very night his whole world had ended. Deucalion rested often during these days, his age and the night's exertions having clearly cost him more than he readily admitted, and Talos found himself, without quite deciding to, taking on more of the old man's usual watchfulness, checking on him through the days and nights of their crossing with a care that went beyond mere practical necessity. Something in their relationship had shifted too, in the aftermath of the theft that had also become, unexpectedly, a rescue. Ariadne spoke little of her own losses during this crossing, though Talos knew she had left behind a mother among the town's population, a woman she had hoped to send for once their theft secured them sufficient means. She did not know, any more than the rest of them did, whether her mother had reached safety before the mountain's final violence, and she carried this uncertainty with a quiet stoicism Talos found himself deeply admiring. He found himself thinking often, in these long hours at the rail, of the particular moment in the villa when he had chosen to help the trapped servant rather than simply complete his escape, turning the choice over from every angle, trying to understand what exactly had moved him to make it. He did not think he had become, in some sudden transformation, an entirely different kind of man. But he recognized that something in him had responded, in that critical moment, to a call he might once have ignored entirely. Deucalion, in one of their quieter conversations during the crossing, offered his own observation on the matter, suggesting that a person's true character revealed itself most clearly not in ordinary circumstances but in the sudden extremity of genuine crisis, and that Talos, faced with such extremity, had chosen a kind of decency that the old thief confessed he had not been entirely certain his student possessed. Talos received this observation with more emotion than he expected, the old man's evident pride settling something uncertain in his own private accounting of himself. The stolen goods themselves became, across these days of crossing, a strange and complicated burden rather than the simple triumph they might once have represented, Talos increasingly uncertain how he felt about wealth acquired in the very hours his whole town had begun its final ending. He did not propose returning them, an impossibility now in any case, but he found himself thinking of them less as a victory and more as an unexpected inheritance from a life that no longer existed in any form he could return to. Ariadne noticed this shift in him during one of their quiet conversations at the rail, and asked directly what he intended to do with his portion of the theft once they reached their destination. Talos considered the question honestly before answering, and found that he did not yet know, only that he suspected the money would need to serve some purpose larger than simple personal comfort if it was to feel, to him, like anything other than an uncomfortable relic of the night everything had changed. Deucalion, overhearing this exchange, offered the observation that wealth acquired through hard skill and careful risk had never, in his own long experience, needed apology, whatever circumstances happened to surround its acquisition, and that Talos should not allow the strange coincidence of timing to poison what remained, in the old thief's judgment, an honestly earned if dishonestly obtained fortune. Talos found some comfort in this perspective without fully accepting it, aware that his own feelings about the theft, and about himself, had grown more complicated than either simple guilt or simple satisfaction could adequately describe. He understood increasingly across these quiet crossing days, a different man than the one who had climbed the villa's rooftop just days before, though he could not yet say precisely what that difference amounted to. The ship continued its steady course across days that blurred together in the particular timelessness of ocean travel, and Talos spent much of this time simply watching the water, turning over the whole strange arc of recent events, the careful planning, the violent tremor, the choice in the villa, the long slow grief of watching his homeland's smoke rise and finally vanish behind them. He did not know, watching that water pass beneath the ship's hull day after day, what waited for him at their eventual destination, what kind of life a thief with a complicated new conscience and an uncomfortable fortune might actually build in an unfamiliar port among unfamiliar people. He knew only that whatever life awaited him there, he would carry into it something he had not possessed before the mountain spoke, a clearer sense of the kind of man he actually wished, given the choice, to become. Land finally appeared on the horizon on the crossing's final morning, a foreign coastline unlike anything in Talos' own homeland, and the ship's passengers gathered at the rail with a mixture of relief and fresh apprehension, the practical business of arriving somewhere entirely new now pressing in alongside the grief they had carried across the whole voyage. Talos watched the approaching shore with Deucalion beside him, the old man's strength somewhat recovered across the days of rest the crossing had, despite everything, provided him. The port they reached bustled with a different rhythm than their own harbor had, foreign languages carrying across the docks, unfamiliar goods stacked in unfamiliar patterns, a whole complicated world that none of them had any established place within. Ariadne, ever practical, began immediately assessing what opportunities the port might offer, her sharp eye already picking out details that might prove useful in whatever new life they were now required to build. They found modest lodging near the harbor with the last of their more ordinary funds, saving the theft's proceeds for whatever larger purpose they would eventually decide upon, and spent their first days in this foreign place simply adjusting to its unfamiliar textures, learning enough of the local tongue to manage basic transactions, observing the particular rhythms of a harbor town that operated by rules none of them yet fully understood. Talos found himself, in these early days of displacement, drawing on skills he had never expected to need in quite this way, the careful observation that had once served his thefts now serving instead the more urgent purpose of simply understanding a new world well enough to survive within it. He watched the foreign market's patterns, the movement of its watchmen, the habits of its wealthy households, though now with a curiosity that felt, to his own surprise, less predatory than it once might have. Deucalion adapted more slowly, his age and his decades of habit in their hometown making this foreign place feel, to him, more genuinely disorienting than either of his younger companions found it. He spoke, in quiet moments, of the particular grief of an old man forced to begin again somewhere entirely unfamiliar, a grief Talos recognized but could not fully share, his own younger flexibility offering him an adaptability the old thief could not as easily summon. News reached them slowly, in the weeks that followed, carried by other ships arriving from the direction of their homeland, fragmentary and uncertain accounts of what had actually happened to the island in the days following their own departure, each report different from the last, none of them offering the kind of clear certainty Talos found himself desperately wanting. The clearest accounts, when they finally emerged from sailors who had passed near enough to observe directly, described a devastation almost too large to properly comprehend, the mountain's final eruption far exceeding anything the earlier tremors had suggested, ash and stone thrown high enough to darken the sky for days across a wide surrounding stretch of sea. The town itself, these accounts agreed, had very likely been entirely buried beneath the mountain's final violent outpouring. Talos received this confirmation with a grief that felt, by this point, almost familiar, a continuation of the long slow morning that had begun the moment he watched the first smoke rise from the departing ship's rail. He thought of the market, the harbor, the painted buildings, the well with its strange mineral taste, all of it now buried beneath whatever the mountain had finally chosen to release, a whole town's accumulated life reduced, in a single catastrophic span, to something that would exist only in the memories of those who had escaped it in time. He thought too, unable to fully set the thought aside, of those who had not escaped, of whatever number remained who had dismissed the tremors as merely ordinary, who had waited too long or lacked the means to secure passage before the final catastrophe arrived. The sailors' accounts offered no clear number, and Talos found he did not entirely wish to know one, the uncertainty somehow easier to carry than whatever specific grief a precise count might have produced. Ariadne received news, eventually, through a network of scattered survivors gradually finding one another across the ports of the wider trading world, that her mother had indeed secured passage on one of the earliest departing ships, having heeded the initial tremors more cautiously than many of her neighbors, and had reached safety in a different port entirely. This news brought Ariadne a relief so profound that Talos watched her weep openly for the first time since the night of their own departure. Deucalion, for his part, learned that several old associates from their former trade had also escaped, scattered now across various ports much as they themselves had scattered, the whole informal community of the town's less respectable trades finding, in exile, some echo of the networks they had once maintained at home. This news offered the old thief a measure of comfort Talos was glad to see settle over him. Talos himself learned nothing definite about the villa's household, about the servant girl he had helped free from beneath the fallen beam, and this particular uncertainty remained, across the following months, one he carried more heavily than almost any other, a small unanswered question standing in his private accounting, for all the larger unanswerable losses the mountain's violence had produced. As the months passed and the immediate shock of their displacement gradually softened into something more manageable, Talos, Deucalion, and Ariadne began, in their separate but connected ways, to build the beginnings of a new life within the foreign port that circumstance had delivered them to. The theft's proceeds, carefully managed, provided a foundation none of the other displaced survivors around them possessed, and Talos found himself, increasingly, thinking of how that foundation might be used toward some purpose beyond mere personal survival. He established, with Ariadne's practical assistance, a modest trading concern along the harbor, legitimate in every particular, drawing on years of observed knowledge about goods and markets that his former trade had incidentally taught him, even as it had never required him to apply that knowledge honestly. The work suited him in ways he had not expected, offering a kind of steady, visible purpose his old thefts, however skilled, had never quite provided. Deucalion, too old now for any thought of beginning a new criminal enterprise in unfamiliar territory, settled instead into a role as advisor and quiet partner in Talos' growing trade, his decades of shrewd judgment about people and value proving as useful in honest commerce as they had once proven in dishonest theft. He seemed, in these later years, more at peace than Talos had ever known him, the old thief's restless watchfulness finally finding, in Talos' success, a purpose it could settle into without regret. Ariadne built her own modest trade alongside theirs, drawing on the harbor skills she had always possessed, and the three of them formed, in their new circumstances, something that felt increasingly like the family none of them had ever quite had by blood, bound instead by shared history and shared survival of a catastrophe that had reshaped all their lives together. Talos found himself, in quieter moments across these building years, thinking often of the choice he had made in the villa, and of how that single decision seemed, looking back, to have marked the actual turning point of his life more decisively than the mountain's eruption itself had. He had entered that building a thief pursuing only his own advantage. He had left it something else, though he still lacked, even years later, an entirely comfortable word for what exactly that something else was. Word occasionally reached them, across these years of rebuilding, of other survivors from their homeland scattered across the wider trading world, small fragments of news that Talos gathered eagerly whenever they arrived, still hoping, though the hope grew fainter with each passing year, for some word of the villa's household and the servant girl he had once freed from beneath the fallen beam. That word came, unexpectedly, in the 5th year of their new life, carried by a merchant who had, by pure chance, encountered a small community of their homeland survivors settled in a port considerably further along the trading routes than Talos had ever personally traveled. Among this community, the merchant reported, was a household that had once occupied a grand villa in the old town, its members having escaped, by narrow margin, on one of the final ships to depart before the mountain's ultimate violence. Talos arranged, through careful correspondence across the following months, to confirm what this fragmentary report suggested, and learned, eventually, that the servant girl he had freed had indeed survived, had married since into a modest household in her new port, and had spoken, on more than one occasion to those who knew her story, of a stranger who had appeared from nowhere on the night of the great tremor to free her from beneath a fallen beam before vanishing again into the chaos of that terrible evening. He did not reveal himself to her, in the end, judging that whatever comfort the mysterious memory provided her was perhaps better left undisturbed by the more complicated truth of who her rescuer had actually been and what he had been doing in her family's home that night. But the confirmation of her survival settled something in him that had remained unsettled since the night of the eruption, a small definite answer to the single question that had haunted him longest. Deucalion, when Talos shared this news with him, expressed a satisfaction that went beyond mere relief, observing that whatever else the whole terrible episode had cost them all, it had also, in its strange way, revealed and confirmed the better nature Talos had always possessed beneath his careful thief's exterior, a nature the old man confessed he had hoped, across all their years of training, his student might eventually discover in himself. Ariadne, hearing the same news, simply embraced Talos with the wordless understanding of someone who had witnessed the whole arc of his transformation from its beginning, and the three of them sat together that evening in a quiet celebration of news that closed, at last, one of the last remaining open wounds their shared catastrophe had left behind. The years continued to pass in the rhythm of their new life, Talos' trading concern growing steadily through the careful attention he brought to it, Ariadne's own enterprise flourishing alongside it, and Deucalion aging peacefully into a respected elder within the small community of their homeland's scattered survivors, a community that had, across the years, gradually found and gathered one another across the ports of the wider trading world. Talos married, in time, a woman from within this same scattered community, drawn together by shared history as much as by simple affection, and found in this new family the kind of settled belonging that his years as a thief, however skilled, had never offered him. He spoke to his own children, in time, of the old town, of its painted buildings and its harbor and its mountain, though he found the memories grew softer and less painful with each retelling, grief slowly transforming, across the years, into something closer to simple remembrance. Deucalion died peacefully in his old age, surrounded by the family he had, in his own unconventional way, helped assemble, and Talos buried him with a grief that carried, alongside its sorrow, a genuine gratitude for everything the old thief had taught him, not merely the careful skills of a dishonest trade but the deeper lessons about character and choice that had ultimately mattered far more. Ariadne remained a close and constant presence across all these years, her own trade eventually merging formally with Talos' own, the two of them building together a modest but genuine prosperity neither could have easily imagined during their years of careful theft in the old town. They spoke, sometimes, in quiet moments, of the strange chance that had made them both survivors of a catastrophe that had claimed so much and so many, and of the responsibility they both felt to make something worthwhile from the unlikely gift of their continued lives. Talos told the story of the villa, in time, to his own children, though he softened certain details and emphasized others, presenting himself less as the thief he had genuinely been and more as the man he had ultimately chosen to become in the critical moment that mattered most. He was not certain, telling this story, whether he was protecting his children from an uncomfortable truth or simply allowing himself, at last, to define his own life by its better rather than its harder moments. The wider world, across these same years, gradually absorbed and half-forgot the catastrophe that had ended Talos' old life so completely, other disasters and other stories eventually crowding out the immediate memory of a single island's destruction, though among the scattered community of actual survivors, the old town's memory remained vivid and carefully preserved, passed down deliberately to children who would otherwise have no way of knowing the world their parents had once called home. Talos grew old himself, in time, watching his own children build their lives within the trading world he had established, and found, in his final years, a peace he had not expected to find, the whole long arc of his life settling, in his own reflection, into a single clear shape, a man who had begun as a thief and ended as something considerably more complicated and, he hoped, considerably better. He died as he had lived his later years, surrounded by family, in the modest prosperity his trade had built, and was remembered by those who survived him not for the thefts of his younger years, which faded quietly from memory as such private histories often do, but for the steady, generous man he had become in the decades of his exile, the founder of a small trading concern that continued, after his death, under his own children's careful management. The old town itself, meanwhile, remained buried beneath the mountain's ash exactly as the sailors' accounts had first described, forgotten by the wider world across the passing centuries, its memory surviving only in the increasingly distant and half-mythologized stories the scattered survivors' descendants continued, generation after generation, to tell of a magnificent lost civilization swallowed whole by the sea and the mountain together. These stories traveled, across the centuries, further than any single family's memory could have carried them alone, absorbed eventually into the wider mythology of the ancient world, tales of a great and advanced civilization lost beneath the waves, a story that would, many centuries later, find its way into the writings of philosophers who had never themselves heard the original, now nearly unrecognizable, account of an actual town and an actual mountain and the actual people who had lived and loved and, in some cases, stolen and rescued within its narrow painted streets. Nobody, by that much later age, remembered the name of the thief who had chosen, in his town's final violent hour, to save a stranger rather than simply flee with his stolen goods, nor the name of his mentor, nor his closest friend, nor the servant girl whose survival had settled his own conscience so completely. Their names, like nearly all the names from that magnificent vanished town, were never written down anywhere that survived the centuries between their actual lives and whatever half-remembered legend eventually replaced them. Centuries passed over the buried town, the ash that had entombed it hardening gradually into stone, the whole settlement preserved beneath this accidental protection in a stillness that no ordinary passage of time could otherwise have granted it. Streets and buildings and even the delicate colors of painted frescoes held suspended exactly as they had stood on the final ordinary morning before the mountain's violence began. When archaeologists finally began excavating this buried town, in an age separated from Talos' own life by more than 3,000 years, they found a preservation so remarkable that early observers could scarcely believe what their careful digging gradually revealed: multi-story buildings still standing to considerable height, vividly painted walls retaining colors that seemed, to eyes accustomed to the faded ruins of most ancient sites, almost impossibly vivid and fresh. They found, too, something that distinguished this site from so many other ancient catastrophes their careful science had studied: an absence rather than a presence, no skeletons scattered through the buried streets and buildings, no evidence of a population caught unprepared by sudden disaster the way so many other ancient towns had been caught. The town's population, the evidence increasingly suggested, had successfully evacuated before the mountain's final and most violent eruption. This absence puzzled and fascinated the excavating scholars in equal measure, for it meant that somewhere, scattered across the ancient trading world in ways no surviving record could now trace, the actual descendants of this vanished town's population had once lived out full and ordinary lives, their homeland's memory carried forward not through the town's own physical continuity but through whatever oral tradition and eventual myth their scattered communities had managed to preserve. The excavated buildings, as they slowly emerged from centuries of volcanic ash, revealed a level of sophistication that surprised even scholars well versed in the ancient world: advanced drainage systems, multi-story construction, a wealth of imported goods suggesting extensive trade connections reaching far beyond this single small island, all of it preserved in a completeness rare among ancient sites of comparable age. Among the ruins, excavators found evidence of ordinary daily life interrupted mid-motion in ways that spoke, across the vast intervening centuries, directly to the humanity of those who had once lived there: cooking vessels left in place, tools set down as their owners had left them on what must have seemed, at the time, only a temporary departure rather than a permanent and final one. Scholars studying the site's broader context gradually connected its catastrophic history to ancient legends of a magnificent lost civilization, the philosopher Plato's account of a great and advanced society swallowed by sea and disaster bearing striking resemblance, in its timing and its general shape, to the actual documented history this excavated town increasingly revealed. Whether this particular town was truly the origin of that ancient legend remained, and remains, a matter of careful scholarly debate rather than settled certainty, but the resemblance proved compelling enough to capture the imagination of each new generation of researchers who studied the site. The excavation continued across many decades, revealing more of the buried town with each careful season of work, and among the countless artifacts recovered were small, ordinary objects that spoke most directly of individual lives now impossible to fully reconstruct: a child's toy, a woman's simple jewelry, a merchant's careful ledger of trade goods, each object a small window into a life lived in full ordinary detail before the mountain's final violence brought it to its abrupt suspension. No record survived, among these countless recovered objects, of a young thief named Talos, or his aging mentor, or his sharp-witted partner, or the watchman who had pursued him across so many careful years of pursuit and evasion. Their particular story, however dramatically it had shaped their own lives, left no trace that any future excavation could ever hope to recover, one small human drama among countless others that the buried town's population had certainly experienced and that history's careful record had simply, inevitably, failed to preserve. But the town itself remained, patient beneath its ash for 3,000 years, offering its silent testimony to a civilization that had reached remarkable heights before an ordinary mountain, on an otherwise unremarkable day, decided to end it, and offering too, in its telling absence of the dead, a quieter testimony to however many actual people, unnamed and unremembered now, had managed, through whatever combination of caution and courage, to escape its final violence and carry their towns. memory forward into lives history would never fully record. And so the buried town remains, patient beneath centuries of ash and scholarly excavation, its painted walls and multi-story buildings testifying still to a magnificent civilization that reached a height few of its era could match, and testifying too, in its remarkable absence of the dead, to some unknown number of ordinary people, thieves and merchants and watchmen and servants alike, who read the mountain's warnings carefully enough, and acted on them bravely enough, to carry their towns. Memory forward into lives no record could ever fully capture. Perhaps some of them became, in the retelling of centuries, the seed of a legend about a lost and perfect civilization swallowed by the sea. Perhaps they were only ever exactly what they were, ordinary people who loved their harbor and their painted walls, who stole sometimes and helped each other sometimes, who watched a familiar mountain until the morning it finally asked something different of them, and who walked, or sailed, away from everything they knew into a future none of them could see, carrying only what they had chosen, in the end, to value most. Sleep well. This is the Hush Historian, and I will be here, softly, whenever you need me again.